Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here. I want to give you a perspective on a lot of things that you already know and you have seen. I'm just going to repackage it a slightly different way so that I can get some ideas about social integration out of the changes in family that you're all aware of. You've seen some graphs have already been on the board and so on. These strong global trends that I call economic demographic transition are from large and less educated families towards smaller and more educated families. This transition contributes to social integration, I would argue, through greater gender balance. But it also causes more inequality by reproducing existing ones. And that's because families become more important in production of education than governments. And my assumption is that most governments, certainly in the MENA region, have been in the past trying to provide access to schooling on an even basis. Sometimes they've done better and sometimes they've done worse. But when you get to the family, and that family becomes important in education, they certainly take care of their own kid only. And they want to put all their resources in the promotion of their own child's future. So that becomes a basis for future inequality. So what I want to argue in the end, then I have a slide on policy, is that the government should be doing something about equality of opportunity, as well as doing something about this grand transition. Well, the unfortunate fact is that in several of the countries of the region, government policy runs contrary to these strong social trends, so that you have laws that attempt to take the power of women away where they have gained it inside the family. So you have a micro trend and a macro trend, and I'm going to talk about both. The micro trend is what I call economic demographic transition. It explains the role of the family in economic growth. So there's a fairly large and expanding body of literature in economics that explains how, for example, the Industrial Revolution in Europe was because, or was in sync with the transition of families from large to small, from producers of children to producers of human capital. That's a theory due to Gary Becker, Robert Lucas, two Nobel Prize winning economists from the University of Chicago. I'm going to explain that and show how MENA is doing in that transition. And then I'm going to talk about how the implications of that for social integration has worked out. If women become more important in the family, does it mean they become more important in society at large? It also suggests that we should be, governments, policies should take advantage of this transition rather than try to stop it and go contrary to that. And I'll discuss that after I show you some of these large trends. I've grouped countries, MENA countries, into three groups. Low income, which is basically Yemen, Djibouti, and Iraq. For 2011, its income was less than $4,000, that's the criteria. Then middle income up to $15,000 per head, that's PPP, purchasing power parity, dollars. And then high income above 15,000, it happens to include mostly the oil-rich countries in this neighborhood. And you notice that fertility transition, this is the total fertility rate, is slower among the poor, but is fastest among the middle-income countries, not the high-income countries. The high-income countries have a slower transition, still have higher fertility, in part because their income isn't so much derived from productivity as it is from natural wealth, and that tends to delay fertility decline. In terms of mortality decline, which you can take here as a standing for general government investment in various things, investment in education, electricity, roads. Obviously, the rich have done the best. In child mortality has declined fastest, and weakest decline is seen in the low-income group. The other side of this coin, I'm trying to juxtapose fertility decline with schooling. The rise of schooling is rise of schooling in all of these countries. This is the average years of schooling for the 15 to 19-year-old population. Think of them as the children. And I think it's for the next speaker. So you have a rise of schooling fairly strong in the other two groups, in middle and high income groups. And you see how high that trend is. Look at this graph, which looks at the average of Arab countries, that's the blue line, against other regions like East Asia, Latin America, and South Asia. It's true that the Middle East is lagging still behind these regions, developing regions like Latin America and East Asia, but it is rising at a faster rate. And what that tells me is that the economic demographic transition, which has these two components, fertility decline and rise of education, is working at least as effectively in the Middle East as elsewhere in transforming the families. Remember, the players here are families, are parents who make these decisions about years of schooling and for their children and fertility, which becomes very important to the lives of women. This graph shows the transition on both dimensions in one graph. Actually, these are four graphs that now I see is very small. So let's look at them one by one. This is 1980. I have picked these numbers 2.5 as a threshold for low fertility, separating low fertility from high fertility. I've picked 8 years of schooling, which is called basic education, to separate low education from high education. And these are averages. The size of the circle that you see here is average per capita income for that country. So you could see how rich the country is. Now, countries in this quadrant are all before transition. So as late as 1980, all Middle Eastern countries were in the, what I call the underdeveloped quadrant. They had high fertility and low investment in the education of their children. Now, let's see what happens 10 years later. Not a whole lot, but they're moving in the right direction, except for Yemen and the Sudan. Most of them have moved down, and Kuwait is right at the border here, followed by Turkey, Tunisia. Bahrain is crossed over. That's Algeria, crossed over on the education side, but still high fertility. 10 years later, in the year 2000, still quite a good number of MENA countries are not in this developed quadrant. This is a quadrant where you see, because of the size of circle, all rich countries inhabit. Iran is here, Tunisia is here, again Algeria is at the border, UAE is right there, Turkey and so on, and Qatar is there. So they are all moving in the right direction, and 2010, quite a few of them are in the developed quadrant. The lesson I take from this is that the families, decidedly for the last 3 decades, have been following this purple line, which is a regression line for all the countries of the world. And you can see that the countries are tightly situated along this average behavior. The average behavior is strongly favoring the hypothesis that in order to become richer, get your circle bigger, you have to reduce fertility and increase education. You get some countries that are kind of odd, like Jordan. They have like too much education given their fertility, or you could say their fertility decline is lagging behind their education. And Iraq is, you see the 3 poor countries that I picked, Western income, they're all left in this quadrant, including Syria. So those are 4 countries that by 2010 had not made the transition to the development state. So these are positive micro trends. How do they square against the macro trends? Again, these are the trends, both the micro and the macro, that you know of. I'm just putting them in slightly different framework to make a point. So you heard about the fact that labor markets have not been able to accommodate the change in the role of women and the family. So you have a strong historical trend that's getting women to live inside the family very differently, to spend much less time bearing children and raising children than teaching them. That's where the education comes from. Now these women in other countries, average countries, say European countries, Taiwan, Korea, even in Turkey, they also move outside and they start behaving differently. For example, they work outside the home. They get more education for themselves and they like to participate more. But men on labor markets, it's as if they are out of sync with this historical trend. And I think a lot of the crisis that emerges at the level of the family is because the macro does not accommodate the micro. And I'm taking the micro as a historical fact, something that's going to happen, something that has happened everywhere and can't be stopped. Education has not helped youth get jobs. This is a very important part of the family. If the family has become child-oriented, as it has, then if the children they train, they invest in for education to get a job, are unable to get a job outside, that would look, again, like an incongruous event. Here's a family doing the right thing, doing the thing that happens everywhere, globally, just trend towards lower fertility and greater investment in children, only to find out that the education they have given to their children in this region isn't that useful. Children stay long with the families. There has to be a lot of income transfer within the families. Children are unhappy. Parents are unhappy. Parents have jobs typically. Children are less likely to have jobs. But the family is unhappy because it finds what I call this modern world, sliding that purple line, not a very happy experience as it should have been, as it has been elsewhere in the world. Part of the problem is that the investment they do in education is mostly for quantity, is to get the years of schooling up. Governments, schools, parents all cooperate to do one thing, to make sure the kid rises higher and higher in the education ladder. Less careful they are about investing in quality, which I identify with skills that other people are interested in, besides the parents. That's the private sector. Finally, about this asynchronicity between the micro trend and the macro trend, something I pointed out earlier, education-oriented families reduce social integration by increasing inequality of opportunity. So they increase social integration because if women become fuller partners within the household, their role is no longer a very simple one, taking care of the rest of the family. They are producers of human capital. Human capital is the most important production input. So through the change in the family, they have become socially better integrated, despite the macro problems. But by doing that, by families becoming more effective players in economic growth, women becoming more effective players in economic growth through their activities within the family, they are reproducing inequality of one generation, taking it to the next, sometimes making it worse. Let me show you one graph of this macro story. Again, you've seen this graph in different forms in this meeting. This is the share of women in total employment. Typically, you expect about 70% of women to be working, especially when fertility is down. If you run a regression of fertility on women's employment across the globe, you'll find out that countries like Korea, Malaysia, and the OECD are much more normal for countries where women have only 2 children. But when you look at MENA countries, except for Kuwait and Qatar that have a higher participation rate, typically 1 in 5, 1 in 4, 1 in 3 of the workers, people employed, are women. Youth unemployment is very high. You can probably not quite see these numbers, but Zafir's definitely pointed to these. One thing I disagree. Is he here? Could I disagree more strongly? No, he's not here. He said that this is nothing strange because Middle East unemployment rate for youth is much lower than Spain and Greece. He failed to mention that this is the world MENA youth have been living for the last 2 decades. For the Spanish and the Greeks, it's been like 2 years. A Spanish young person considers the life of 2011, 2012 abnormal. They expect it to get better. They're not living the kind of nightmare these Middle Eastern youth who are unemployed long-term live. For them, getting out of school and hanging out for several years in parents' homes is considered normal. Their worldview is being formed by what they experienced. The worldview of the Spanish is the worldview of Europeans, which is, at times, let's do something, let's find the skills, let's go somewhere else to get the work and move on. And something very strange is going on in several of these countries. And I'm sure you're all aware of the tumults, the difficulties that this has raised for youth, lack of hope, not knowing in which directions they want to move. Now, I want to get to one of the last points, which is about what is wrong with MENA education. And there's going to be 2 things. One is what I pointed to earlier, a lack of connection between years of schooling and the level of skills achieved. There's a lot of attainment, not enough achievement, which is learning and skill formation. Interestingly, the role of the families is actually greater in achievement than in attainment. In some simplified way, you could think of attainment as the job of the government. Build the roads, they bring electricity, build the school, hire the teacher, and have compulsory education, and the kids will go in. So you get that to that number 8, average years of schooling, pretty much by government requiring you to be there and then providing a school for you to go to. Schooling achievement, which is learning and skill formation, is the job of the family, and in particular, the mother. Because, this is my argument, because the macro side does not value skills as much as it values attainment, learning, years of schooling. Families are imposed to do the historic transformation, to raise the kind of kids who are ready to go get jobs. Some of them become entrepreneurs, some of them become very creative, productive workers. For example, a lot of people would argue that creativity is not something teachers can teach, but parents can. It takes a lot more tender loving care to get a creative kid to express herself than a kid who has got a memory or is good in manipulating mathematics. Any teacher could do that. Now, we have, fortunately, some numbers to look into learning. So we have a lot of numbers for schooling. That's the stuff that World Development Indicators, all UN statistics are full of. But some NGOs have gotten together, there's now 2 or 3 of these, collect test the scores, administer tests, and collect the numbers and make it available to researchers in math and science for countries that are willing to participate. Luckily, in 2007, 16 MENA countries participated. I guess they didn't do so well, so 3 of them decided not to participate in the following year. If you look at 2007, 2011, you get this graph for mathematics scores for boys. What is striking about this graph, and you may not know it, is that this number 500 on top here is the average for the world. All MENA countries are below that by a good margin. Turkey in 2011 almost got there. Lebanon is 452. It's not quite there. And there is no strong trend except for Qatar, which was the worst performing MENA country in 2007. All of a sudden it has pulled itself up quite a bit. And I don't know what happened. It'd be very interesting to know what are the policies in Saudi Arabia and Qatar that created, and Dubai, that created this big jump one year, one round to the next. But still, we have done better than other regions in terms of the speed with which we have been increasing quantity of schooling, but there is no speed here that I can see in learning. As many countries have a decline in their score as they have an increase, and the ones that have an increase, I'm not quite sure how the numbers did go up. A very similar story for girls. If you want to compare girls and boys, the girls are doing better than boys in most of these countries, especially in countries that are oil rich. See Oman here, for example, the girls are doing much better than boys. Qatar is like that, Saudi Arabia is like that. And then you have other countries where, like Syria, Tunisia, where the boys do better in math scores. Now, there's something we did in a paper with Nadia Belhaj and Raghi Asad, which is to look at the inequality of discourse and see to what extent we could account for that inequality by a set of variables we call circumstances. And those variables are family background and community characteristics. And we found, and community characteristic is like average quality of the teachers in the neighborhood, average class size in the neighborhood, size of the city. Family background includes things like mother education, father education, number of books at home, and whether or not the child spoke the language of the test at home. When you put this into a decomposition routine, what you find here is the percentage of inequality of scores that is explained by these variables I call circumstances. And the maximum here is 50%. And the numbers here are quite large when you look at them, when you consider them in the international context. If you look at European countries, they will all be around here, between 15 and 20%. You can only explain in Europe about 20%, less than 20% of a child's success in terms of learning, in terms of where she is in the class rank, by her parents. The other 80% is her own achievement. Here, when you're looking at the Middle East, you find quite a range. You find Algeria, which is the lowest. We're not quite sure why. But we find a bunch of countries, Turkey, Dubai, Lebanon, Egypt, Iran, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, that are more than 25%. These are numbers very close to Latin America. A couple exceed Latin American estimates, where they have used similar data to do the same thing. So we are seeing here increasing role of the family, but also increasing inequality, and that is not something that this is the last slide. So the policy implications, I'm going to go very quickly over it. The main policy implication is recognizing the historical trends. You need to align policies in order to take advantage of it instead of fighting it. So instead of passing family laws that keep these women who have been enabled, empowered within the family are coming out, to send them back in, you try to make it easier for them to make a transition so that the changes in the family and changes in society are in sync. I am saddened because I work in family planning to see Iranian government turn against family planning, and many people, conservative backlash, saying that all our problems, meaning women getting education, not being able to get married, wanting jobs, wanting positions in parliament and so on, this is because of the pill. Because the government did actively promote family planning, and Ayatollah Khamenei has expressed regret and expect God to forgive him for having done that too much. That's what I call bad policy, meaning fighting a trend, trying to solve social problems, whereas you ought to be able to, you ought to be willing to accommodate this greater empowerment of women, greater education of children, and so on. So, reform family laws, especially where divorce is concerned, so that women have greater bargaining power within the household, in sync with what the historical trend is having them to do, which is to educate the future generation. Increase women's status in economic and civic life. Reform education so that the training they're doing becomes more productive, so that they don't send the kids to schools only to find out they're staying at home and they're unhappy. That requires labor market reform and education reform. And finally, you need to have equality of opportunity policies. It's no longer sufficient to build schools in poor areas. You must help poor parents do better with their children. If in Egypt and Jordan, rich families are using private tutors in order to give a leg up for their children, various testing that they have to go through, it behooves the government, it behooves the middle class, the upper class, to pay up so there are after-school training for less advantaged kids. Thank you very much.